Zainab and Aisha were only 11, but life had already demanded far too much from them. Abandoned on the side of a busy road with nothing but each other and a cloth sack of memories, the twin sisters had learned how to survive by watching the world pass them by. That is, until one day, when a wealthy man named Bako stopped his car and saw not just two dusty children, but a reflection of a life he thought he had buried long ago. What followed wasn't charity, it was something deeper, a bond built from pain, memory, and a second chance that none of them saw coming. This is the story of how the forgotten can be found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoy real stories with heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. The sun had not yet reached its peak, but the heat was already clinging to the earth like a heavy blanket. On the edge of a dusty road that curved between two crumbling buildings, two young girls sat huddled together. Zainab, the older of the twins by a few minutes, wrapped her arm tightly around Aisha as if shielding her from more than just the sun. Their clothes, once colorful, had faded into tired earth tones, patched and frayed at the edges. Aisha clutched a worn cloth sack to her chest, the only thing they had left from the home they were forced to flee. Cars roared past, indifferent, their wheels sending up tiny storms of red dust. The girls had learned not to expect anything, not a glance, not a coin, not even pity. People didn't stop for children who looked like ghosts, too thin, too quiet, too forgotten. Zainab adjusted the scarf over her sister's shoulders, her eyes scanning the road not for food or money, but for safety. They had been there since morning, and even though hunger clawed at their bellies, leaving wasn't an option. That spot, right by the broken concrete slab, felt safer than wandering. They whispered to each other about the taste of jollof rice, about the way their mother used to braid their hair, about what it might feel like to sleep on a soft mattress again. They weren't expecting rescue. They weren't waiting for a miracle, but then came the sound of a slowing engine. A sleek black SUV, cleaner than anything else in the area, came to a stop just ahead of them. The windows were tinted, the engine humming softly, but the girls didn't flinch. They had seen expensive cars before. They always drove past. But this one didn't move. Zainab and Aisha sat still, eyes narrowed in instinctive caution. From inside the car, a figure shifted, watching them. And though they didn't know it yet, this was the moment everything began to change. Not because they asked for help, not because they cried out, but because someone finally saw them, not just as poor twin girls sitting by the side of the road, but as children who mattered. The tinted window of the SUV rolled down slowly, revealing the face of a man in his late 60s. Bako was a man known for his wealth. His business empire stretched across cities, his name whispered in meetings, written in glossy magazines. But in that moment, none of it mattered. His eyes, framed by gold-rimmed glasses, settled on the two girls, narrowing slightly as if trying to recall a dream long buried. He had only intended to take a different route that day to avoid traffic. But as soon as he saw them, sitting still, silent, covered in dust, but holding on to each other with quiet strength, something in him paused. There was something in Zainab's eyes that struck him. It wasn't just the hollowness of hunger or the dull ache of abandonment. It was resilience. It was the kind of gaze that didn't ask for help, but had long earned it. Aisha leaned into her sister's side, blinking quickly as she tried to avoid direct eye contact, holding the sack close. Neither of them moved. They had learned from experience not to trust the curious stares of strangers, no matter how well dressed they looked. Bako's driver shifted in the front seat, unsure whether to speak, but Bako raised a hand slightly, still watching. His heart, usually guarded by contracts and numbers, began to ache in a way that surprised him. He had seen children like them before, on television, in reports, on charity flyers, but there was something different this time, something about how quiet they were, how they didn't stretch out their hands, how they simply sat and waited for the world to move on without them. He looked down at his wristwatch, then back up. He didn't know their names, or why they were there, or how long they had been sitting in that heat, but he felt it. That old pull in his chest that reminded him of a boy he used to be, alone, forgotten, waiting by a gate that never opened. And now, here they were, Zainab, Aisha. He didn't know their names yet, but he would, because something about that moment whispered to him, if he drove away now, he might never sleep the same again. Zainab reached into the sack Aisha had been clutching and pulled out a small, flattened piece of bread. It was dry, crumbling at the edges, but it was all they had. She tore it in half and handed a portion to her sister without saying a word. Aisha took it, not because she was hungry, though she was, but because Zainab had offered it with that familiar gentleness that had held them together through every storm. They chewed slowly, more to silence the hunger than to find taste, letting the crumbs fall where they may. Bako was still watching, still seated in the back of the SUV. He hadn't spoken, hadn't moved, but his eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. There was something about the way they shared the bread that made his throat tighten. He had once known that kind of silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind built from survival, the kind that filled the air when children grew up too fast and learned that even food could be a quiet act of love. He remembered, all at once, the stale bread he used to share with his brother behind a warehouse after their father disappeared. He remembered how they used to laugh with dry mouths and swollen feet, pretending to be kings with nothing but crumbs in their palms. The memories hit him like a tide, ones he had buried under years of progress, wealth, and the need to forget. But seeing those girls now, especially Zainab's steady hand and Aisha's silent obedience, stirred something long untouched. A vendor pushed a wheelbarrow past them, filled with fruit and roasted maize, but didn't stop. He didn't even glance their way. The girls didn't reach out. They didn't beg. That was what haunted Bako the most. They were too used to being invisible, too used to being ignored. And as they nibbled that cold bread like it was a feast, he realized he couldn't just sit and watch any longer. He leaned forward slightly, his voice still unused, but ready to break the wall of silence. These weren't just two children on the side of the road. They were a mirror of pain, of perseverance, and of a life he had promised himself he would never forget, even when the world tried to make him forget it. The clouds had been gathering quietly, unnoticed behind the weight of the day. Then, as if the sky had finally had enough, rain began to fall, soft at first, like a whisper, then heavy and fast, drenching the earth in seconds. Zainab reacted immediately, pulling Aisha closer and reaching into the sack for the thin, tattered wrapper they used as shelter at night. She stretched it above their heads, holding it with both hands as the rain soaked her sleeves. Aisha huddled beneath it, shivering, her eyes wide as they stared at the ground that was quickly turning to mud. Bako sat still, unmoving inside the SUV, watching as the downpour swallowed the road and blurred the view around them. Most drivers would have rolled their windows back up and driven away without a second thought. But he didn't. Not this time. The memory of soaked nights from his past, of cardboard for blankets, of shoes filled with rainwater, came flooding back with the scent of wet earth. And as he watched Zainab shield her sister with arms that trembled but didn't break, he felt something tighten in his chest. His driver turned around slightly and asked, almost impatiently, "Should we move, sir?" Bako didn't answer right away. He stared through the open window at the two soaked figures clinging to each other like leaves in a storm. Zainab didn't look toward the car. Her focus was on Aisha, always on Aisha. She wiped water from her sister's cheeks with her own damp hands, whispering something to calm her down. Words Bako couldn't hear but could feel, because once, long ago, someone had whispered the same to him. Finally, he pushed open the car door. The driver's eyes widened. "Sir, the rain." Bako stepped out without a word, letting the rain soak his agbada, the fabric growing heavy against his shoulders. He walked toward them slowly, his sandals sinking slightly into the mud. Zainab saw him coming and tightened her grip on the wrapper, her eyes sharp with caution. Aisha pressed closer. He stopped a few feet away, careful not to frighten them. His voice was low but warm, not demanding, not threatening. "Are you all right?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The rain kept falling, but something in the air had shifted. Not because a rich man had stepped into the storm, but because, for the first time in a long time, someone had stepped toward them instead of away. For a moment, neither Zainab nor Aisha spoke. The rain softened, falling in rhythmic drops, as if giving space for breath. Zainab's body tensed, her arms still stretched to hold the wrapper above her sister's head, even though it had long soaked through. Her eyes locked onto Bako's, not with defiance, but with a protective wariness learned too early in life. Aisha stayed silent, hiding just slightly behind her sister's shoulder. Bako didn't press. He knew too well what fear looked like when he wore the face of a child. He took a small step back, enough to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to take you anywhere," he said quietly. "I just want to understand." His words hung in the air like the rain mist around them, gentle, uncertain, waiting. It was Zainab who finally broke the silence, her voice soft and rough. "Our mother is gone," she said. "She got sick one night and never woke up." Her eyes didn't blink as she spoke, but Aisha's hand reached for hers beneath the wet cloth. Zainab continued, slower now, as if choosing the least painful words. "Our step. Uncle said we were too much trouble. He said we brought bad luck. He threw us out when the neighbors stopped helping." Bako listened without interrupting. Each word fell like a pebble in his heart, stirring old waters he thought had long stilled. He glanced at Aisha, who hadn't yet spoken, but whose entire body trembled, not from the cold, but from remembering. "We've been here a while," Zainab added, eyes still steady. "Sometimes someone gives us water, a few people drop bread, but mostly, we just sit. It's better than moving around." She glanced down the road, as if expecting someone to call them back, though there was no one left to care where they went. Bako inhaled deeply. He had spent decades building his fortune, his companies, his name, but none of that had prepared him for the hollow ache he felt standing in front of these girls. Not because they were poor or abandoned, but because they reminded him that no child should ever become used to being unwanted. He wanted to ask them more, where they slept, what they dreamed about, how they kept going, but he could see how tired they were of answering. So he simply nodded. "Thank you for telling me," he said gently. And just like that, the distance between them, once shaped by fear, began to quietly shrink. Bako took another step forward, careful not to startle them. The girls didn't move away this time. Something in Zainab's expression had softened, just slightly. A shift barely visible to the eye, but deeply felt. Aisha looked up at him briefly, then back down at her feet, her small fingers still tangled in the damp edge of the wrapper. Bako's gaze lowered for a moment, and that's when he saw it, a faded, curved scar on Aisha's right forearm. Not fresh, not bleeding, but long-healed and unmistakable. A deep line that had once run angry and red, now pale and forgotten by most eyes. He knelt down slowly, so he was no longer towering over them. He didn't reach out. He simply looked. "That scar," he said quietly. "I had one just like it, in the same place." Zainab frowned slightly, confused, but Aisha lifted her arm gently and looked at the mark, like she hadn't noticed it in months. Bako touched his own forearm, just above the wrist, where a scar once ran from a childhood accident, a broken glass during a quarrel in the streets, when he was their age, barefoot, frightened, and alone. "Mine came from running one night when we had nowhere to sleep," he continued, his voice low, almost as if speaking to himself. "I fell into a gutter trying to chase a slice of bread someone had thrown out. I still remember how the pain felt, not just in the arm, but in the heart. That kind of pain doesn't go away quickly." Zainab didn't speak, but her body relaxed a little more, and in that moment, a quiet understanding passed between them, one that didn't need words. Aisha, too, lifted her eyes, just for a second, and studied his face. He didn't look rich to her then, not important, not untouchable. He looked tired, familiar, human. Bako let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "You remind me of someone," he said. "Not someone I knew, someone I used to be." He rose slowly to his feet, not turning away, not rushing back to the comfort of the dry car waiting behind him. Rain had long stopped falling, but the ground still held the dampness of what had passed, just like the girls, just like him. And without saying another word, he made a silent decision in his heart. He couldn't walk away from them. Not now. Not ever. The street was quieter now. The rain had driven away most of the midday traffic, leaving behind puddles that reflected the sky and the peeling walls of nearby buildings. Bako turned to his car and gave a subtle nod. The driver hesitated, unsure of what that signal meant, but opened the back door anyway. Bako looked back at the girls, his voice gentle but firm. Would you come with me? Just to get out of the wet? Get something warm to eat. Zainab looked at Aisha, her brow furrowed. She didn't answer right away. They had been warned all their lives not to follow strangers, especially the ones who seemed kind. But nothing about Bako felt dangerous. He hadn't rushed them. He hadn't touched them. He had simply waited and listened. That, more than anything, made her feel less afraid. She gave a slow nod. Aisha mirrored her, quietly stepping beside her sister. They climbed into the back seat together, their small hands brushing the leather seats like it was on familiar land. The scent inside was sharp, clean, expensive, nothing like the smells they were used to. They sat close, back straight, unsure if they were allowed to lean or breathe too deeply. Bako sat across from them in the opposite rear seat, watching them carefully, not with scrutiny but with concern. The driver started the engine, glancing at the rearview mirror with confusion that he didn't voice aloud. No one spoke for the first few minutes. The car moved smoothly, the sound of tires gliding over wet ground filling the silence. Zainab looked out the window. Aisha held her sack tightly, even though it was nearly empty. They didn't ask where they were going. They were too used to not having control, too used to following the road wherever it led, so long as they were together. Bako kept his eyes on them. He noticed how Zainab never fully let her guard down, how her eyes flicked from door to window to the space between them. She was thinking 2 steps ahead. Even now. Aisha sat more quietly, but every so often, she looked at Bako when she thought he wasn't watching. There was no hatred or fear in her gaze, just curiosity. He leaned back, the hum of the car wrapping around them like a blanket. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man returning to an empty house. He felt, somehow, like something had followed him in, and that something might just stay. The ride led them through wide streets lined with large houses and iron gates, neighborhoods Zainab and Aisha had only seen from a distance. The car turned into a quiet driveway, flanked by tall hedges and flowering trees, and came to a smooth stop in front of a spacious house. It wasn't loud or flashy, but it breathed wealth, quiet, old wealth that didn't need to prove itself. The girls stepped out slowly, their sandals touching clean stone for the first time in what felt like forever. Bako led them inside without fanfare. The house smelled of wood polish and warmth. A soft rug welcomed their bare feet. A maid appeared from a side door, but froze when she saw the children, her eyes flicking quickly to Bako, who gave her a silent shake of the head. Not now. No questions. The girls stood near the doorway, unsure whether to walk further in or turn back. He motioned gently toward the hallway. Come, you can rest in here. They followed him into a small guest room, bright and simple, with a low bed and a folded blanket. A tray of food, warm rice, stew, and fruit, was brought in moments later. Zainab didn't reach for it until Bako nodded. It's all right. Please, eat. They sat together on the edge of the bed, eating quietly, methodically, like they had learned to make every bite count. Aisha, halfway through her food, finally spoke in a whisper. Why are you helping us? Bako sat in the armchair across from them, resting his elbows on his knees. He thought for a moment before answering. Because someone should have helped me, and didn't, he said simply. His eyes flicked to the small birthmark near Aisha's jaw, the same one his sister once had. It startled him how small memories could echo through strangers. After they finished eating, he leaned forward. May I know your names? Zainab sat up straighter. I'm Zainab. This is my twin sister, Aisha. Bako repeated the name softly, almost reverently. Zainab, Aisha, They sounded familiar on his tongue, though he had never spoken them before. He excused himself, but instead of walking away, he stood outside the door for a while, eyes closed, letting the sound of their quiet breathing remind him of something he had lost long ago, something he might now have the chance to restore. He didn't know where this road would lead, but for the first time in many years, he felt it was the right one. The house fell into a quiet rhythm over the next few days. Zainab and Aisha remained cautious but calm, staying mostly in the guest room, speaking in soft tones and sharing space the way only twins could. They never asked for anything, never explored beyond what was offered. Each morning, they folded their blanket neatly. Each evening, they ate whatever was brought to them, always side by side. Bako watched them from a distance, torn between instinct and reason. His heart had already decided, but his mind needed something more: truth. He didn't want to assume. Too many people wore convincing masks. So, without informing them, he asked his assistant to quietly investigate. It wasn't mistrust, it was responsibility. If he was going to open his home and possibly his life to these girls, he needed to be sure. Records were scarce, no registered guardian, no official birth documents. But one by one, neighbors from the area where the girls had once lived began to speak. An old woman at the corner shop, a local tailor, a teacher who remembered seeing them walk their sick mother to a clinic. The story lined up. Their mother had passed quietly, and after that, the girls simply disappeared. Meanwhile, Bako observed how they moved, how Zainab always placed Aisha between herself and any doorway, how Aisha watched her sister for silent signals before speaking. They trusted no one, but they trusted each other completely. One evening, he brought them a simple box of colored pencils and paper. No instructions, no expectations. Aisha began to draw. Zainab sat beside her, watching. Not once did they ask what the pencils were worth. They just used them. When the report finally came in, Bako sat alone in his study, reading the summary with a heavy heart. Everything they had told him was true. The names, the abandonment, the quiet suffering. No family had come looking for them. No one had asked. They had simply slipped between the cracks, surviving only by their will and each other. He placed the report on his desk and stared out the window, thinking not of numbers or risks, but of Zainab's eyes the day he first saw her, steady, guarded, but not without hope. That night, he didn't sleep much, but by morning, the decision was no longer a question. They weren't just girls who needed help. They were children who had found their way to him for a reason, and he would not let them be forgotten again. Morning light spilled softly across the polished floors as the girls sat together at the small breakfast table, heads bowed over their plates, whispering to each other between careful bites. The quiet had become familiar, almost comforting, but that morning carried a different kind of stillness, one that felt like the moment just before something changed. Bako entered the room with calm steps, dressed in a simple tunic rather than his usual regal attire. He didn't sit down. He stood beside them for a moment, looking not at their small hands or their tattered belongings, but at their faces. The faces of girls who had learned to survive in silence. The faces of children who had seen more than they should have, and yet somehow still held each other with love. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice soft but steady. Zainab looked up first, eyes alert, searching his expression. Aisha followed, her fingers clutching the edge of her seat. Bako took a breath and continued. "You don't have to go anywhere. This is your home now. If you want it to be." For a second, they didn't move. The words seemed too large, too heavy, like something their ears weren't sure how to carry. Zainab blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Aisha looked at her sister, waiting, but Bako didn't take it back. He knelt beside them, leveled his gaze with theirs, and added, "Not as guests, not for a little while. I want you to stay, to grow here, to be safe here." Aisha's eyes filled first, her lower lip trembling as she tried to hold it back. Zainab bit hers, not wanting to cry in front of anyone, but even she couldn't stop the single tear that slipped down her cheek. For the first time in what felt like forever, They weren't being passed along or turned away, they were being chosen. The staff watched from a distance, unsure of what to make of this new chapter. But Bako didn't care what they thought. His heart had made space for these girls, and nothing else mattered. Later that day, Zainab and Aisha walked through the halls with quiet wonder, still side by side, still holding on to each other. But something was different now. The fear had loosened. The silence was softer, and the road they once sat beside, waiting for the world to pass them by, had now led them somewhere they never imagined: home.